Start recording. Can you start the recording? Okay, so our statement regarding virtual meetings. In light of the 2020 COVID-19 virus and current guidance regarding physical distancing to reduce the potential for spread, meetings of the Richmond Regional Planning District Commissions have transitioned to a virtual format. Regional public bodies were granted authority to conduct meetings electronically pursuant to the provisions of Virginia Code, Section 2.2-3708.2, and related legislation approved by the General Assembly of Virginia during the period of the governor's state of emergency declaration for COVID-19. While we do not know the exact duration of the current practice of electronic meetings, we will continue to function in this manner until such time as it is deemed appropriate to return to in-person meetings. Staff provided notice of this meeting and the means by which we are virtually gathered to members of the public on October 5th, 2020 through electronic posting on the Plan RVA website and email distribution of notice to members, alternates, and known interested parties, including the media. This meeting will be recorded. Audio and visual recordings of the meeting and materials will be posted to the Plan RVA website within 48 hours of this meeting. Any members of the public participating as an observer during the meeting today may submit comments or questions at any time prior to or during the meeting via email at rrtpoinput@planrva.org. All comments and questions submitted at this time will be reviewed following the meeting, and to the extent practical, responses will be provided or posted on the Plan RVA website. We ask that members identify themselves first when speaking so we can more accurately record the activities of the meeting. All lines should be muted to minimize additional noise and feedback. You may unmute your line at any time to request acknowledgement from the chair. Does anyone have any questions regarding the process for assuring effective facilitation of this meeting or for how members of the public may participate? Hearing none, I will now ask the clerk to certify that we've followed the approved procedures for appropriate notice of this meeting and the means by which we are convening. Ms. Mueller is actually not able to attend today. So I will go ahead and state that we did in fact follow the approved procedures for this notice of this meeting. So please indicate your presence by saying aye when your name is called during a roll call. Anyone who wishes to identify themselves following the roll call will be invited to do so. And I will now take attendance of the members. So for Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Aye.
For GRTC, Ms. Torres. And Ms. Del Ross.
Aye.
For Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Aye.
For Henrico County, Ms. Smiler.
Aye.
And for the City of Richmond, Ms. Moore-Clark.
Aye.
Okay, so we do have a quorum, and I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Miles. The first item on the agenda is consideration of amendments to the agenda. Does anyone have any amendments or propose any amendments? Seeing none, we'll move on to the second item, which is approval of the September 10th, 2020 meeting summary. First, I'll ask, does anybody have any discussion regarding the minutes of the meeting? And if there are none, can I request a motion to approve?
Sharon Smidler, so moved.
Joe Vadina, second.
All those in favor? Okay, Miles, sorry.
Yeah, I have to take the roll call again. So for Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Aye.
For GRTC, it looks like Ms. Torres has joined us. Or Ms. Del Ross.
I'll say aye on her behalf.
Okay. For Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Aye.
For Henrico County, Ms. Smidler.
Aye.
And for the City of Richmond, Ms. Moore-Clark.
Aye.
All right, so the motion carries.
Moving on to the third item on the agenda, task 1, draft text. I will turn this back over to Miles.
Okay, thank you. So this is the bulk of the meeting. We're here to discuss the draft text that was sent out with the agenda. As noted at the first meeting, this is the first of the 3 main tasks for the draft, and then the 4th task is working through the adoption and getting a final document ready. So the draft document as presented basically has 7 sections. So there's the MPO program overview. This is essentially why are we doing this? What are the sources of funding? For each of them, I'll go into a little bit of detail, but it gives a little bit more information. The second step in the plan is the 4-step process outline. That's basically walking us through project submission, project screening, project scoring, and then project selection and allocations. The next 3 sections go through each of the programs and talk about the eligibility for funding on both the project side and the sponsor side. And then they will also cover scoring, which is not in today's meeting. And then the last 2 sections, the first is project allocations. That's basically everything financial. So how do we allocate money for new projects? How do we cover cost overruns? What do we do with leveraging? Basically all the information we need to know. And then the last section is development and reporting. This is basically how are we tracking all of the projects and making sure that they're progressing on time and on budget. So the first section was on pages 6 and 7 of your agenda packet. So this was the program overview. It's basically just the introduction to MPO funding. It's 2 paragraphs about each source and a link to the FHWA fact sheet. And this is taken directly from our website with some minor revisions. Basically, it's what we've been using to share the information to the public about what we're doing and why we do it. So we thought that this would be a good introduction for the plan. Does anyone have any questions or comments, concerns about the program overview section of the draft? Okay, so not hearing any, move on to the next piece of the draft. So the next section was the 4-step process. So the first step is obviously getting applications. So this is the submission section. That's on page 8 of your agenda packet. Basically, this follows what we've been doing. There's very little that's proposed that would change here. So for RSTP and CMAQ, the schedule would be presented to TAC the month before the applications open. We would put the call for projects, the calendar of the timeline for the application process, and then the guide to any supplemental materials like what we sent out this cycle would all be posted on the website and sent to TAC members. We'd have a 1-month application window. This is a little bit shorter than what we've done in the past. It's generally been about 6 weeks, but we found that most of the applications come in the last week or 2. So there's really no point in extending it any farther. So shorten it down to 1 month and then electronic submissions only, which is in line with how we've been operating with the Google Forms. The biggest change that we're proposing in terms of the submissions is the second bullet. And that's basically that TAC would be able to limit the types of applications in any given application year. The thought behind this is if we already have a lot of projects that are coming up to their next phase and already using up the bulk of the money that would be available, we might not want to accept all types of projects for that particular year. We might want to say, hey, we've only got $2 million. Let's limit it to bike ped and studies only. So it's just an option that TAC can use. They don't have to at any point, but it's just another option to make sure that we're using the funding kind of the most appropriately, given the scale of the projects that could be funded. And then for the TA set aside, this is all new. We would be putting TA in our guidelines as well. It's VDOT administered, so it goes through the SMART portal. The TPO would put a call for projects out 2.5 months before the deadline. And then we're required to endorse every application that's in the MPO study area. So that's the basic overview of what we would be doing for new submissions. Are there any questions about the project submission as proposed or any concerns with the changes from what we're doing currently? Okay. So not hearing anything there, I'll move on to the next step in the process. So the next step is the project screening. So this is a little bit more detailed, and there are some changes in this that I think we'll want to discuss a little bit more in depth. So this is found on pages 8 and 9 of the agenda packet, so the bottom half of 8 and all of 9. For TA, it's very easy. The eligibility and all the screening is done by VDOT once you submit in the SMART portal. We don't have to do anything. We basically endorse it. They handle everything and they give it back to us with the state score in January. So not much to do on this end. For RSTP and CMAQ, there's basically 6 things that we're proposing to look at for screening. This is largely what we're already doing, but with some changes in how we're approaching it. So the first is consistency with federal regulations. Essentially, is the project type and the project sponsor appropriate for the fund? Is it eligible? Is that project something that we can actually use RSTP or CMAQ on? The second is long-range plan consistency. We've been doing this, comparing it to the long-range plan goals, but with the updates proposed for the long-range plan, it would work differently. And I'll go into more detail on these last 5 bullets here. This third is the schedule, which is vetted by VDOT, and the cost estimate, which is also vetted by VDOT. We're currently doing this now. Once you submit the applications, we send them over to Liz and the district, and then L&D gets us back a yes, no, we think this one needs to be higher. And so there is already that give and take. So that's already part of the process, but we are proposing some changes here. And then the supplemental materials, that's just making sure we have everything we need to score a project. And then project presentations, which is what we're proposing to take place in November instead of the sponsor meetings that we've been holding. So I'm going to go into detail for each of those. For the LRTP consistency, this is going to be a big one, and this is a definite change from how we've been operating. So this is something you've probably already seen from the LRTPAC, from the advisory committee, and you can find it again on pages 13 and 14 in the agenda packet. So essentially, every project is determined to be either local and programmatic or regional. Local projects are generally the smaller scale, they don't impact capacity. Regional are either crossing jurisdictional boundaries or they're larger capacity type projects. So if it's a local project, it's already eligible. It'll be accounted for in our long range plan in terms of funding. So there's nothing else to be done. If it's a regional project, basically it needs to be in the constrained plan. So that's the whole point of having the LRTP, is that we have a list of constrained projects. So if it's already in the constrained plan, that's great, it's eligible. We just move it on into the next part of scoring. If it's not in the constrained plan, it wouldn't be eligible right away. So what would have to happen would be a long range plan amendment. So if there's a project that comes up in, say, 3 years that wasn't accounted for when we first made the project list, we'd have to go through an LRTP amendment, which would entail scoring it, prioritizing. We'd have to show the financial constraint again, and then have public comment. If the changes were adopted, then it would go back through this process and you could submit it for the next funding cycle. So this is a change that's kind of beyond RSTP and CMAQ. This is being handled through the LRTP committee. But this is essentially how it would work in practice. And then if you look on page 13 and 14, it breaks down which project types fall into which of the 2 categories. So this is a definite change. I'm open to hearing any questions, comments, concerns about this approach.
Miles, Diana. I'm usually pretty good with aligning plans, so let me try to figure this out again. So the constrained long-range plan, is the long-range plan typically constrained? Because I thought and then, I thought that the TIP, which is a transportation improvement plan, is constrained. So when did the long-range plan become constrained?
So they're both constrained. Basically, the long-range plan, it's a lot more loose. We kind of divide it generally into 4 time bands. And we say, okay, we're estimating there's going to be $600 million in this time band, and we can only spend $600 million within that time period. So it's a little looser in terms of constraint, but it's still a limit on how many projects can fit within those fiscal limits.
And then with that question, so even when you have, is it then, just from my days on working on a long range plan, I know it was very loose even in the project description. So it wasn't a tight project that equals 600 million. It was either, this type of project, you could do it up to the 600 million. So then it really played a different part when it comes to this not in constrained plan and in the constrained, because if it says, interchange improvements within 600 million, then any interchange improvement that a locality brings would then be able to move forward in the process, because the long range plan, so it seems like it makes it very, very constrained.
So I guess the intent with the long range plan, anything that's local, and if you look in the agenda, it's broken down. I think those are on the page 14, but all the local projects, you don't need to have it specifically listed. It's just, that's a local project. It doesn't need to be in our regional constrained list. So any of those types of projects would be the way that you just mentioned. There's a pot of money and all of those can still get funded. And that's, in most bike ped projects, road projects that aren't capacity increases would generally be there. A lot of the stuff that gets funded through RSTP and CMAQ, I think, would generally fall under the local programmatic. The regional is generally going to be bigger items like new transit stations or adding new lanes on the interstate or converting more of Broad Street to bus-only lanes, that sort of thing, where it's broader regional impact and usually on the bigger roads. And those would need to be specifically listed, that we would need to say, okay, Broad Street, bus-only lane from here to here. Somewhere that should be identified in the long-range plan before we'd be able to fund it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the point being, the big projects are specifically listed. The stuff that usually comes into RSTP CMAQ would fall under the catch-all local project category. But again, that's all on 13 and 14. So if you have questions about specific projects, we could go into those, or you can always email me too if you think through them when you're looking at that list as well.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments on the LRTP consistency?
Not really, but I know I need to update. I know each of the counties were tasked with updating the LRTP list, and I know I still have a lot more to do with our team to update that, but this reiterates the importance of doing that.
That's a great reminder. Thank you. I was supposed to remind everyone about that as well today, so thank you for that. So the second piece of the vetting then is the schedule. I think this one is also going to be something you'll want to discuss a little bit more. So this would apply to any project which leads to construction, essentially anything that we can work with VDOT to vet. So the transit projects, generally the studies and the TDM programs wouldn't require the same information for the schedule. And that's just because it's not the way that they operate. A study, we get a scope of work. The TDM programs, we get annual reports. So it's different requirements for those, and that will likely continue moving forward. We'd want something detailed enough for screening. The key change here is that we're proposing to review them before submission with VDOT. So the way it works right now is when we get the schedule and we get their cost estimates, we forward them to VDOT, and then we wait for VDOT to get back to us on their review. That usually takes 1.5 to 2 months, and our selection process then takes 7 to 8 months. The goal of having it reviewed ahead of time would be to speed that up. It would also be to increase coordination between VDOT and the locality sponsor. Since you're already talking about the project on the very front end before it's even fully funded, you can start working through some of the concerns and questions. This is definitely a change and it's a break from the way we've done it. So I'd like to hear any feedback you have on this proposal.
And this is Sharon. So is it kind of like the pre-apps for Smart Scale?
Similar. That's kind of what we were thinking, is we could just send it over. And basically when you get it to us, it would already have gone through some sort of initial, yes, 2 years is reasonable for PE on that project, as opposed to, I guess, going back a step, one of the issues that we encounter now is a lot of the project applications we receive have 1 year for PE, 1 year for right-of-way, 1 year for construction, and it doesn't matter what the project is, we just always get the same schedule. And so that's not realistic, and it also makes it very difficult for us to allocate funding to match the schedule when the schedule isn't really the schedule. So
Okay.
to fix that, what we're proposing would be this vetting. So essentially, it's just coordinating with the district, and we'd have to work out that process with VDOT, which is why we're giving ourselves a year to figure it out. But basically working with the district to get those schedules just okayed. It doesn't necessarily have to be all the details worked out, but just this is reasonable for this project as proposed. And then we can go from there. And if things change down the road, that's fine too. But just getting the initial, this is a reasonable timeline.
Okay.
Any other comments on this component? Concerns?
Just a comment, Miles. So just to be clear, the reason that we're asking for schedule information is for programming purposes and not for scoring purposes.
Correct. So it's all for the programming side. We just want to make sure we have it as accurate as possible to make sure you're getting the money when you need it.
One more comment along those lines as a suggestion would be that it would be to clarify when we request schedule information that I would suggest asking for timeframes. In other words, PE will take X number of months right away, as opposed to we plan to begin on this date, because the date that we begin is always a function of when the money is there. And so it's a circular type thing.
So that was how we did it the last round of RSTP CMAQ, was we asked, what's your proposed start date and how many days do you think it'll take? So that's an approach that we've moved towards. This round, we kind of just left it at what's the proposed start date, because you can go start date to calculate the same thing. And we're just doing it on our back end to save you a question, essentially. But that makes a lot of sense. And we could just do total time frame instead of a specific August 1st of 2022. Okay. Any other comments on the scheduling? Okay. So the next part is cost vetting. This is basically the exact same thing. Applies to anything that's going to lead to construction. We need it detailed enough for screening. So a consultant estimate, some sort of smart scale or vetted project, or the VDOT estimating tools are available online too to help out with those. The new worksheet, we're going to go ahead and include that as well, since that's the new VDOT requirement. Make sure that we're getting that to kind of facilitate the process between the district and the TPO. And again, we're requesting this review be done before the project is submitted. Fredericksburg has implemented this, that all their cost estimates need to go to the district before they come in for RSTP funding. And this is something that we would like to see as well. Again, the same concept that we could speed it up. It would allow us to do much quicker reviews of the projects if that part's already been vetted through the district. Are there any concerns on the cost side? Because I think that's, I know there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to smart scale and everything else on the cost. So any comments or concerns there?
This is Sharon. Yeah, I'd be just a little concerned. Just sometimes a little bit more, VDOT's numbers could be a little bit more conservative, or just the escalation, if that's the right word, percentages for the out years, and what cost estimate we'd be providing it for, like what year.
So I think the approach, like what we started last year, would be to provide all cost estimates in current dollars, and then the TPO can do the escalation from there. So we can adopt a 2.5% or whatever the TPO wants to adopt. And that's something we can work through when we get to the programming piece of this plan, so that it's in our hands and we don't have to necessarily worry about what VDOT wants on that side. But if we get a same baseline to start with, then we know that at least the cost is reasonable based on what the project is proposed. Any other comments? Okay. Well, it sounds like we'll be working with the district to try and get a little bit more detail for how this would work, because I'm sure the subcommittee would like to hear a little bit more on that side as well. So we can try and work with the district to bring this back to you at one of our subsequent meetings, maybe before the final adoption. That way we have an actual implementation plan as well. The second part of cost vetting is the cost vetting that the TPO is going to do. So for anything that's not a construction project, those transit projects, the studies, the TDM programs, we're going to screen those for cost. It's a lot easier for us to do these because you have a scope of work, you have a cost per vehicle, you have an annual report with a budget. It's pretty straightforward. So we're able to vet those costs. The other component is we also are vetting the funding requests. Every project's funding needs to be the same as its total cost. That's something that we've run into on occasion where the requests don't necessarily add up and there's not enough money to make it add up even with outside requests. So we've always encouraged leveraging. That's something that's a TPO guidance for the RSTP program. But this just kind of puts a little bit more detail to it and gives it a little bit more teeth. So it would basically split all applications outside fundings into 3 different categories. So there's committed funding, which is something that you can point to in the SIP or like an approved CIP from the locality and say, hey, we have money set aside here already to help fund this project. So if you have that plus your request from us, that means the total cost. If you're asking for the total cost, that's fine too, because it'll add up. If you don't have anything committed, you can also put expected funding, which is basically, this is a FY24, for example, and we know we have $10 million in CVTA funding that's projected for that year. So we're going to put 2 of it on this project. That's something that we can say, okay, that's a future budget. It's not approved yet, but it's reasonable based on our expectations right now. The other category that would fall in there would be like a pending revenue share application, something that you can give us a firm deadline of, we'll know yes or no by this date. And then the last is leveraging, which is basically where you're saying, we're not asking for the total funding right now. We don't have the total funding, but we want a portion to then go somewhere else to get the rest of the funding. So that's makes a lot of sense now between Smart Scale and CVTA. I mean, looking at the numbers, Smart Scale is about 3 times the size of the RSTP program. CVTA is almost 10 times the size of the RSTP program. So between those 2 sources, you have a lot more funding. So it makes sense to leverage our smaller pool for the bigger pots. So that's basically the 3 categories that we're defining. And again, the goal is that there should always be the total funding equaling out to the total cost, unless you're specifically saying this is just for leveraging. So any questions on that? If you want the details of what we had kind of outlined for the committed and expected, that's on page 15 in the agenda packet. That's 2 tables that walk through it. Okay, well, hearing nothing on that end, which is good. We'll move on to the last of the screening piece. That's the supplemental materials. This is nothing new either. Basically, the change is we're going to publish a document that gives examples of what you should be submitting. It's not all inclusive, but it just helps if you're putting together the application and you're not sure what you need. So we put out an example this year with suggested materials. And it wasn't, again, all inclusive, but it gave an idea of, if you need to provide us a cost estimate, here's the types of things that we'll accept. The key ones will always be the sketch, the cost, and the schedule. Everything else will be determined by the scoring methodology and what we need to evaluate the project. So if it's a crash analysis, we're going to probably need some crash history, that sort of thing. And what we'll be able to do is put together this links to the sources. So if you need crash data, here's where VDOT keeps all the crash data. You can go and pull it for the project. So that's the kind of idea behind this. Really, it's nothing new. It's just kind of formalizing what we've been doing. So any concerns about this piece of it? Okay. So then we'll move on. That's everything for the vetting. The next piece is the project presentations. So this is proposed every November right now. What we do the applications, and then we sit down for an hour or so and we talk through all your active projects and then all your new applications. Instead of going through all of the existing projects, we're proposing, and this is in a future section under a different task, but we're proposing that there'd be some sort of reporting that you guys would fill out a quick form throughout the year to give us an update and just let us know, hey, here's where we are in the project. Here's any unexpected issues that have come up, and here's any potential cost increases or schedule changes that might happen. And that way we have a better sense. We can also work with VDOT. That's essentially what we do in the fall anyway. But that way we're getting reporting from you, we're getting reporting from the project pool system, and we can really get a good grasp on where all the projects are. So instead of going over all of the current projects, what we would do is turn this into more of like a grant presentation. So you'd have 10 minutes to get up in front of the scoring committee and walk us through the project. Why is this project needed? What is it going to do? How is it going to address the areas of concern? How much does it cost? All the basics. And it's just to really give us more insight into your project. We'd have a follow-up Q&A with the scoring team, which would still be VDOT, DRPT, and TPO staff. And then we could clarify any scoring questions, help with the screening. So for example, if we're looking at crashes and you don't have some sort of analysis, we can say, okay, so you said there's this many crashes, what's this project going to do? So we can figure out, okay, this is what kind of mitigation and this is the reduction we could expect. So it's going to help us get to those quantifiable answers. If we need a little bit more information, we can get it from you at this meeting. So are there any concerns about switching to presentations of the new projects as opposed to spending time on the existing projects? Any thoughts or comments on it?
Miles, this is Diana. Maybe, let's see. I don't know. I was typing something, but I know that I make presentations for the employee trip reduction program. Is this only for like the new application? I mean, for applications submittal, or is it for the review? I was hearing like in and out for the review of updates on the current projects.
So this would just be for the new applications. For the employee trip reduction, that's probably going to continue because that's a program and it's ongoing funding. So that one is a little special in how it's evaluated. But this would just be for new applications, which I think on the city side, the way I was thinking of it, this would be a great opportunity because then each of the engineers could come in separately instead of having to put you on the spot for all of the different applications. Because I know everybody handles their own applications.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's good. So yeah, that should be helpful to the process.
Any other comments on the project presentations?
And you said we could consider bringing in consultants to assist or for background help Q&A.
Yeah,
okay.
I think if that's who's developed the application, you feel more comfortable with them there, I don't think we'd have any concerns with that. Our goal is just to get a better understanding of the project because I think, you know, we get what's on the paper, but we don't necessarily get a good grasp of the project right away. So this would just give you a chance to walk us through those details and help answer anything that we see just off the bat that looks like it might be of concern. And this doesn't take away from our opportunity to follow up with you later on too, to clarify things.
Okay, great.
Any other comments? Okay. So then this brings us to the last section of today's task, which is the individual project program eligibility sections. So CMAQ is on page 10. So basically, each of these sections outlines the project eligibility, the sponsor eligibility, and then it'll go through the scoring process. So for the project eligibility for CMAQ, the primary requirements are that it's in the TPO study area and it's in the former non-attainment area. The primary criteria for any of them is that they reduce the ozone precursor emissions. That's basically just the CMAQ program. The next two items are new, and they're not new. It's just kind of more formalizing what we've been doing essentially. So only future phases that have not started. The goal on this is sometimes a project may start locally. It's not funded through the TPO, and then it needs more funding partway through a phase. We're trying to avoid that sort of situation, just making sure if you're already in PE, we're going to fund right away, or construction, we're not going to fund PE for you. Just really making sure that we're looking down the road, a little bit of planning going in. The second piece would be a proposed cap on the amount that you could request per project. So essentially what staff's idea was to take the average amount that's available for each year and then use that as the cap. So for CMAQ, that'd be about $8.5 million. The pot is only $8.5 million per year averaged out. So it doesn't really make sense to put in an application for a $15 million project. You're taking 2 full years of the program. So if we limit it to whatever that number would be, it helps us to make sure that we're funding programs and projects that are of an appropriate scale for the funding source. And again, this kind of goes back to the fact that now with outside sources like Smart Scale and CVTA that are much larger, it makes sense to put the larger projects where there's a larger pot of money. So the other big change in terms of project eligibility is that we would just link to the Code of Federal Regulations. We wouldn't specify there's highway projects, there's bike ped projects. It's just, here's the list of all the sorts of projects that are eligible. The main reason for this is a good project is probably going to have multiple of those elements. And it's always a little weird to say, oh, this project has a bike lane and a sidewalk and transit improvements, but it's also got turn lanes. So we're calling it a highway project. So it's a little weird. You don't get the full benefit of what the project's doing in terms of the scoring. So what we would do is kind of eliminate the categories and just score across the board. This project meets these criteria. So that's kind of the goal in not listing project types. Joe, it looked like you had a comment about the eligibility.
Yes, I did, about the cap amount. I probably want to think about this one a little bit harder. In principle, I like the concept, but I think there's some nuances that we may not want to be as rigid as a number. And, $8.5 million per year, correct, but you wouldn't fund a project in a year. Most of these projects, federal projects, are going to be somewhere between 4 to 6 years in time frame. So, a larger request would be funded over several years. I have to think about it, but I'm not ready to agree to that yet.
Sure, and we knew this would be probably the biggest item that would be a sticker on this. The thought was we have some projects, so this is not CMAQ, but RSTP, for example, has about $20 million a year. We have at least one active project that's a $60 million project. I mean, that's effectively 3 full years of RSTP funding taken up by a single project. It probably shouldn't have gone through RSTP in terms of the dollar amount. It's just way bigger than the pot. So maybe the number's not 1 year, maybe it's, a year and a half worth, but I think that there's a lot of benefit to having some sort of limit. We do this already effectively on the staff side. So when we get applications that are both RSTP and CMAQ, we push the more expensive ones to RSTP and keep the less expensive ones in CMAQ because they're easier to fund with the more limited pot. So it's kind of already happening, but like you said, not as rigid. So what we can do, does anyone else have any thoughts on what those limits could look like before we move on? So what I would suggest then, if you want to think through it, and if everyone wants to send me some ideas of what you think would make more sense, we can come back to this as a discussion item at the beginning of the next meeting, just as the annual cap, not this whole presentation again, but just focusing on the annual caps and what those should be. Does that work for everyone?
What I was going to suggest at the end would be that we'd have the opportunity to kind of digest all of this and that we could comment on any aspect of what you've laid out here.
Sure. And if you want to just, I don't know if you want the Word document or if PDF works for you, but I can also send out the Word document so you can just track changes and send it over to me with any comments. Because we're happy to take comments either way. And then again, we'll bring back, if we get a lot of input on a certain area, we'll bring it back for review at the next meeting for those particular pieces of it. If we don't hear any comment on a section, then we won't bring it back.
I personally like the Word document. I think Chet will attest to that.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
So back to CMAQ then, for eligibility, it's basically non-attainment area localities or agencies that serve those areas. Another idea, this isn't in the draft as proposed right now, but would be a limit on the number of applications. This is not something that we've put in there, but it's getting at the same point as the cap of total dollar amount. The goal is to make sure that the funding is being distributed to projects throughout the region, and also that we're not putting all of it in one basket. Any thoughts on limiting the number of applications per locality or per sponsor, I guess?
I like it. I like it a lot. Yeah, I just think an unlimited number of applications is too much of a burden to put on staff and unrealistic in terms of what we have available.
Anyone else have any thoughts on limiting the number of applications?
This is Sharon. I was just curious how many, like on average, I don't have a problem with limiting it, but I was just curious if there's been an issue in the past or concern about number of applications, or are they like over 10 or just curious.
So it's not the overall number. I think that's really been the problem. I think what we see a lot of though is a big difference between the number each locality is submitting. So the larger jurisdictions, Chesterfield, Henrico, we usually see 10, 12 applications, whereas from the small rurals, we may not see any for several years at a time. And then from the city, we usually get something in between. So it's kind of a mix of what we're receiving. And the idea would be just to make sure that we're also getting a nice geographic balance, that we're spreading it out throughout the whole region too, and not just concentrating on the largest localities. So that was the thought on limiting the number.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, Miles, I think that's a good idea.
Tom, do you have any thoughts as a rural small jurisdiction? I think you're muted.
Thank you. Not as it relates to CMAQ, because we're not within the non-attainment area.
Okay. So what we'll do then is, as part of the proposals that, the changes that we bring back for next meeting, before we get into the scoring topic, we'll bring back a proposal for limits on the number of applications, and then we can use that as our discussion point to jump off. So that's everything for the CMAQ side. RSTP, it's very similar. So project eligibility, it's basically the TPO study area. It's got to be on the federal aid system with the exceptions. There are quite a few exceptions, but basically that means no local roads, no rural minor collectors. And the exceptions are like safety, bridges. There's a handful laid out in the code. Same thing, only future phases, again at the cap limit, so we can discuss that again and bring it back. For RSTP, as an example, that would be 20.7 million. which we have several projects that are above that currently. Same thing, no project types, just kind of all projects are competing in the same pool because a good project should have multiple elements. And then the sponsor eligibility, any member locality or agency. And then the second item has been controversial in the past, but the TPO for modeling or studies. So this would be to complete the LRTP or to work on the travel demand model for the region. And it's been ongoing since I think 2008 now that we've had funding that was initially approved. And there have been 2 other projects for the TPO that have been approved since then. So if we are going to continue with that, we thought it made the most sense to go ahead and spell that out in the eligibility. So, and then same thing, limits.
Don't call it controversial, Miles.
It was in the past. I mean, it's not, obviously, I think now it's less so, but when this was initially proposed in 2008, it was a very close split vote at TAC. It was, I think, 6-5 or 5-4, something along those lines. It was a 1 vote difference. The last 2 times that this has come through, we haven't seen the same splits. It's been adopted along with everything else. So I think a lot of that's behind us, but we just wanted to make sure we include it in the guidelines now for adoption. So,
Miles, I'm sorry, this is Diana. Mr. Coleman, if I could rather. I had some staff conversation a little bit, and so back to the CMAQ. If the city could see, if we could have some additional information on the number of CMAQ projects that we've submitted in the past, and we'll gather our own and as well, but any assistance, we have to kind of still look at that before we're all the way okay with it, only in that I thought there were time periods that we weren't submitting applications and therefore it still went somewhere else. But we're going to have to look a little bit closer to make sure that we haven't been, that isn't our best success rate is through the CMAQ program before we all the way agree with limiting the number of applications.
Sure, I can pull that for everyone. For each locality, I can get the numbers and send that out to all of you.
Thank you.
So any additional comments on the RSTP side of things? Again, this is very similar to what we just discussed on CMAQ, so I think we may have hit on all these points already. Okay, so then the final slide for today is the TA set aside. So this is page 12 in the agenda. Again, since this is largely through VDOT, there's not a lot that we have to do, but basically the eligibility is that it's endorsed by the TPO. There's the full list of projects that it's eligible for, and then our proposed cap, the same thing, the annual average. Again, we can come back to that at the next meeting to discuss what it should be, or if we should find another way to phrase it without quantifying it specifically. And then eligibility is just any member locality or agency that's eligible under the VDOT guidelines, under the CTV's guidelines. So any questions or concerns on the TA side?
This is Sharon. I just have to chime in. I realize we're limited in funding for TA, but just trying to figure out how to fund, the Ashland to Petersburg Trail and different trail projects like that. And we have more options, but I understand that's the amount we're given, but.
Yeah, I think that was one of the thoughts that went behind this, because I know this last round of TA, that was one of the concerns that with the Henrico's projects was some of them were, I think, 1.8 million. So it was a lot larger than the pot. It was almost the entire 2 years worth of funding. So finding a way to balance that with how much money we have. And I think part of the answer may be using RSTP, because everything that's in TA, TA is basically a set aside from the STP program. So that might be part of the solution, and we may need to think through that a little bit more. And again, if we have the flexible caps, then maybe this won't be an issue at all.
Yeah, and it's helpful, just for communication wise, what for people to expect, and scoring is, just the clarification would be good. Thanks.
Yeah. So all of this basically is just to screen the projects once we get them. So everything we've gone through is essentially determining eligibility and making sure we have enough detail to go to scoring. What I'll do, I'm going to send out all of the items that you guys have requested as we've gone through this, the Word document, and then the CMAQ apps. And then if you can get me comments back in the next few weeks, so we can start working on that to prepare it for the next meeting, that would be great. And that way we can have, here's discussion items carried over from the last meeting, and then here's the new items proposed for scoring. Does that work for everyone in terms of the timeline for the changes and updates as proposed by the subcommittee?
Yes.
Okay.
Miles?
Yes.
So I might suggest that you have comments submitted a little bit sooner. I mean, one, while this is fresh, and just to kind of keep the process moving.
Okay. So if we're going to do that, does say next Friday work for everyone? That way we keep it within the next week and a half, and
Or could we? That's an option. Or could we wait till like November 6th, like a week after RSTP and CMAQ applications are due, possibly? Or I'd like to throw that out there for consideration. But I see both points.
Sure, we're flexible either way. So if you guys want to pick one approach and move forward, what we can do is we can say November 6th is a hard deadline, and we could set this upcoming Friday as a target date. And that way, if you don't make it, it's okay. But November 6th is the latest we'll take comments to make it into the next round of revisions.
Sounds perfect to me. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So that's everything I had for the presentation of the draft sections today. So that's back to you, Mr. Coleman.
Thanks, Miles. Does anyone else have any other comments? Going once, going twice. We can adjourn the meeting.